an HLS organized pre-pandemic panel called Why I Changed My Mind. It was very popular back then, and it seems like it's pretty popular this time around too. The George Bemis Professor of International Law, Vice Dean for Library Information Services, and Faculty Director of the Berkman Klein Center, Jonathan Zittrain, will be our moderator. And our faculty panelists are Beneficial Professor of Law Charles Freed, Clinical Professor and Director of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, Rachel Viscomi, and Charles Ogletree, Jr. Professor of Law and Director of the Charles Hamilton Institute for Race and Justice, Guy Charles. Without further ado, then, I'd like to welcome Jonathan.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for spending your time with us today as well. We're interested, I think, by way of true introduction, self-introduction for each of you, to hear just a little bit about something you believed, possibly fervently, that you no longer believe. And Professor Freed, we thought we might start with you because rumor has it, which is to say, I think you told me, that you are writing a book about people who changed their mind. So I'm curious either about them or about you. So take it away.
Well, the book talks about...
There you go. How I changed my mic.
The book talks about really important people, Gorbachev, de Klerk, Madison, and Holmes.
That's a law firm.
It does something like that. But I started out explaining how I came to change my mind on a bunch of things. And then COVID interrupted, and one thing or another in teaching. So I didn't do anything on the book for a couple of years, and now I'm back to it. And I find that the description of my own change that I wrote 2 years ago was really not, what's the word, true? Something like that. And so I thought I'd try it again. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And that's very clever. He was a very clever man. But the implication is that really he's the same man, but the facts have changed, so he's reacting to a different set of facts. Okay, the implication, however, is that he himself has not changed. Well, then there's Emerson. And Emerson said, in Self-Reliance and a number of other places, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. And why is it that people are reluctant to admit that they have changed? Why is that? Well, maybe they're afraid they won't be trusted. And maybe they're afraid they won't be believed. And so they say things that they don't believe anymore in order to be believed. Well, that's a mistake. And so I think about myself. And I was Solicitor General. I was deputy briefly. And then by a series of accidents, I found myself to be the guy. In those days, I was very moved by the fact that at the Harvard Law School, where I had been from the age of 26 until, well then, teaching torts, criminal law contracts, so on, that in the 70s, there was a time, there was a movement radically left. And there were Marx study groups in the faculty. The most interesting and vivid people, some of whom have retired, many of whom have retired, I have not, were very what the French called Marxisants, and I found that was awful. I couldn't stand it. And the reason for that is historical. I am a refugee. I left Czechoslovakia with Hitler as my travel agent in 1939. And then we were going to go back. And then Stalin came, and the communists came, and we never went back. So I thought the idea of Hitler and Stalin made me quite allergic to the left. And that allergy took a form where I wanted to be rather in opposition. And what better way to be in opposition than to go into the Reagan administration?
The rebels against the empire.
That's right. Well, that was an announcement of that. Well, I grew up fast there. I'd always been very sure of myself, but there I was arguing in the Supreme Court for the government on subjects like affirmative action, abortion, separation of powers, voting rights, and so on. And I found that there were people way to the right of me. And then there were the people who worked with me, who were professionals, who were wonderful. They were really the best. And the fact is, of course, that I had a lot to learn. The first appellate argument I made in the Supreme Court. They had a lot to teach me, and it was a small office, and they were nice people, and they were good people, and we were a team. So I learned a certain moderation, and then I came back here. And what had changed? Well, I think what had changed was I was older, and I had lived, and I had children. One of them is a clinical psychologist, another is a professor of philosophy. I had grandchildren, 4 of whom are in college, and we talk. And I have to listen as well as talk, you know. So in the course of that, it has changed me. It has changed me, and all I can say is I like my students better than I have ever liked them. And that's a wonderful thing. So that's
That was great ending with red meat
That's
to the
enough.
audience. That was perfect, I gotta say. You've set down the standard for the rest of the panel. It's kind of an interesting tale. At first I thought you were about to announce that you had become a Marxist and that was how you changed your mind. But it sounds like that's an evolution still in progress. But the other thing that jumps to mind maybe is that you listed out some reasons why it could be hard to change one's mind. And as you listed them out, I think they all kind of ring true. One of them may be, though, that you end up, possibly if you are a high-profile person, as you have been for so many years, that when you do state a position, you end up with your friends choosing you, not the other way around. You have a number of allies. They come to expect certain things of you, and to betray them by changing your mind might be a lot of social or, depending on your situation, financial pressure. Do you think that is another reason why people don't change their minds? Were you ever cast out of the conservative movement for speaking heresy?
Oh, listen, I am a charter member of something called Checks and Balances, which is a firm anti-Trump wing of the Republican Party.
This is CHECKS, not CZEC.
That's
Yeah,
right.
just given your family history, I wasn't sure.
And,
Yeah.
You know, we write op-eds, we write amicus briefs
Yes.
on subjects like the administrative state.
And does that mean, by the way, you now feel like you're without a home of sorts? Or are you being embraced by people that you might have been on the other side of the divide of?
Well, you know, first of all, I do have a home. This is my home,
Oh.
and my children and grandchildren are my home. And you know, they didn't choose me. So there you are.
Well, it sounds like they lucked out. But one last question. Oftentimes, when in the public eye you've signed a petition, maybe as part of Checks and Balances, or you've written an op-ed, when it is a position that I imagine from what you were saying before you might describe as moderate or sensible, but it is at odds with the person that the article that was up here was describing.
Yes.
For which I don't know, the text was pretty small and it had that 1980s Xerox quality that made it hard to read. But this was an article describing somebody who I think would be characterized as a movement conservative
Yes.
of that time. Just sort of orthodox about a bunch of stuff. Now, when you write, one of the first lines is, and this was Reagan's Solicitor General. In other words, the fact that you once were a movement conservative, do you think that it rightly lends credence to the fact that even Charles Fried thinks that this particular policy is bananas, which is an interesting way of changing your mind, adding to your throw weight rather than taking away from it?
If so, so be it. That is lovely. I mean, the one line that I'm proudest of lately was about the current Supreme Court. And I wrote this appropriately in a letter to the New York Review of Books, that the current Supreme Court seems to be determined to repeal the 20th century. And you know, I don't want to repeal the 20th century. 20th century, where we live in the 21st century. So I hope that answers your question.
I think it does. Thank you very much. On to Professor Viscomi.
Hey, well,
And I don't know if your mic is turned on yet. So feel free to switch it. There you go.
all So in the email about this event, one of the lines was, almost any topic is fair game. So we're going to test that a little bit.
I did leave wiggle room with the word almost.
But we didn't have to prove it. One of the things I really enjoyed about this panel last time was that there really was a mix of personal and professional, and I was all teed up to talk about a professional topic. And then we celebrated my oldest daughter's 19th birthday this weekend. And so I was thinking back to when I was pregnant with her. And I decided to share a story about birth and about my own sort of journey of transformation in thinking about birth. So for me, the answer to how I changed my mind is, I haven't done a scientific analysis, but I'm going to say 4 out of 7 times, it's because I read a book. And this is an example of one of those times. So I was pregnant with my daughter. I had never been pregnant before. I hadn't given a ton of thought to birth. But if you had asked me in the first several months, I would definitely have said, like, listen, I don't have anything to prove to anyone. We've come a long way. I have no interest in suffering unnecessarily. Like, I'm going to be on that epidural train the minute it pulls up. That was my plan. And I'm one of 4 kids. I was the product of natural childbirth. My mom, the modality that my parents adopted, you chose a song to sing while you were in labor. And so even though my mom technically chose different songs for all of us, she always reverted to what she had chosen with my older brother, which was the 59th Street Bridge song. So for folks who don't have a deep familiarity with Simon & Garfunkel's catalog, that is the one that is also called Feelin' Groovy. And I was not sure what my mom had experienced while giving birth, but I was pretty sure that groovy was probably not the top feeling. So that had always struck me as absurd, and I thought, we undervalue women's pain. It's, stratospherically bad when we look at people of color, but basically, I don't need to, sign me up for the epidural.
And I hate to say, just given the generational spread within the room, does everybody know what an epidural is? Yeah, okay, just checking.
Great. Thank you for that. If there are other moments where I share things that are, feel free to let me know. But I won't get too deep into the details. My cousin happened to say, a friend who had recently given birth recommended this book to me. The book itself is actually not that important, although I can share what it was. It was Misconceptions by Naomi Wolf. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And I read it. I have not read it since, so this was 20 years ago. And at the time when I read it, it really kind of just reconfigured the kaleidoscope of my understanding of birth in a lot of ways. There just were things I had never contemplated. It was new information to me about the ways in which birth was medicalized, the ways in which very routine interventions beget additional interventions, and what that means in terms of statistics for birth outcomes, all these kinds of things. The details aren't important because my goal is actually not to persuade anyone of whether and how they should give birth. But what was interesting to me was that I couldn't reconfigure the world in the way that it looked before I had read the book. And I have quibbles with a lot of things in the book too, but it had really just shifted the way I understood birth. And so I started to read a lot of other books, also very typical for my changing my mind process. I started to read a bunch of books, I started to talk to a lot of people, and I felt really, really scared. Because I felt like this is going to mean that I need to make a whole bunch of decisions that are going to have a big impact on what comes next. And so I started doing a lot of research. I started looking into birth centers. I started looking into non-medicalized childbirth. And I went to my OB, who I loved, and I said to her, hey, I've been doing all this research, and I know when we talked in the first meeting, I told you I had this particular vision, and I think my vision is changing, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to give birth here, because the physical plant of the hospital that she was tied to was really rooted in the notion of a medicalized birth. So in the ways in which, for folks who have been through this or who have thought about this from this angle, there's a lot about, hot water and baths and all these different things that are helpful, none of which were really part of the physical structure of the hospital. So I talked to my OB. I was in a state of some distress. I was sobbing at the time, full disclosure. And she was like, yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. Like, pregnant women are not sick. Like, pregnancy is not a sickness. You don't need to wear a Johnny. You don't need to have a bunch of, monitors hooked up to you for the most part, right? Unless something goes wrong. And so I went to tour the birth center here in Cambridge. And the physical plant was totally different. It was, queen-size beds and giant tubs in the rooms and like a very resident, like home kind of atmosphere. My husband did not go with me. He was more terrified than I was. He was like, like, this seems like a terrible idea. I asked him to come to the birth center. He couldn't go on that tour, and he was like, so my image is mostly, and by the way, I was still dyeing my hair at that point. He was like, my image is that it's going to be like a lot of long-haired, like gray-haired women sitting around like smoking weed. And that did not turn out to be what it was. He came on a second visit, and he was like, oh, they have like some shiny, they do have like oxygen tanks and stuff. Like, there are like some shiny things. I feel a little bit better about it. He was like, but what I really want to know is what your dad thinks. So my dad was a doctor and had a lot invested in the important parts of traditional medicine. And so when I had talked to my dad about it, he said, honey, birth is a whole lot of nothing up until a couple minutes that are critical. And if something goes wrong in those minutes and they need to transfer you across the street to get you into the hospital, or if you need a level 3 NICU and you don't have one, those moments have a huge impact. So a couple, 20 years out from some births, I can say a whole lot of nothing is not how I think anyone who has been through the process would describe it. So that was helpful, because I was like, okay, I take your opinion, and also I'm going to weigh it based on lived experience. But I talked with my dad and my OB about like some of the criteria for which they transfer you out. I ultimately did make the shift, and I did decide to deliver at the birth center. But that isn't where I delivered for my first daughter, because I went into labor with my first daughter, and there were immediate signs that she was in distress. And they told me to go straight to the hospital, which I did. Her umbilical cord was wrapped around her in 3 different places, including her neck. There were 1 million people in the room. The moment, and actually when I arrived, the first thing they said, I had been promised, by the way, by the hypnobirthing instructor that I found after I made this shift, that what I was going to experience was not pain, it was pressure. And it was the belief that it was pain that was going to turn it into pain, but if I listened dutifully to my cassettes, that would not be my experience. So
The torts exam is writing itself right now.
She, incidentally, had also never given birth. She was also So I arrived at the hospital. I'm pretty sure I woke up like the entire, like all of West Cambridge with my screaming on the way there. I arrived, and they were like, okay, like you it says here you want to give a natural birth, have a natural birth. And I was like, I'm rethinking that! And they were like, no, you can do it. You're going to be fine. Everything is okay. You've got this. And I was like, I don't think I have this. And they were like, you definitely have this. Also, it's too close. We can't give you anything now, even if you wanted it. So ultimately, she was born. I was grateful to have a doula there who I had found through this whole process because she was in some distress when she came out, they immediately swept her away, and she was surrounded by a whole group of doctors. And my doula said to my husband, to me actually, she said, "Do you want Dave to stay with you or go with a baby?" And I said, "I want him to go with a baby." And in that moment, one of the nurses spun around and she said, "No." And the doula said, "It's your baby. You can go to her." And he did. And she was fine. And she is a very healthy 19-year-old. But so that birth didn't look at all the way that I thought it would, but it was affected in a million ways by all of the things that had shifted for me. And then 3 years later, I had my second daughter. She was delivered at the birth center. Honestly, people, it was pressure. It wasn't pain in that instance. It was 3 hours. It was kind of blissful. Like, it was like a totally different experience. So, not to everyone should do their own research and make their own decisions, but the thing that called this story to mind was really the ways in which, for me, when I have changed my mind, it is almost always that I am operating on the basis of a set of assumptions that I have not thoroughly considered, or if I've thoroughly considered them, there's a context outside of it that I haven't taken into account. And I was reminded of this looking at an article this weekend that was talking about how your average, like, Western individualist US person looks at the Mona Lisa, and they are looking at the figure of the Mona Lisa, the face, and specifically the eyes of the Mona Lisa. But that if you take someone who comes from a culture that is more focused on, like, the interconnection between people and nature, or has a more collectivist lens, or a more, right, and you, like, scan people's eyes, they're looking as much at the background and at the nature that is in the background as they are at the figure in the foreground. And that to me felt pretty representative of what my own experience in changing my mind has often been like. It isn't, there are these two views, I had this one, now I have this one. It's like, oh, the ground underneath my feet has shifted in a way that makes it impossible to understand this thing that I understood in one way before in the same way after. So.
Thank you. I'm like relieved it all turned out okay.
It all turned out okay.
Yes, thank you. I mean, one thing that possibly jumps out so far is that Professor Fried told a story of reflecting on topics that are the classic cerebral topics of policy debate and changing his mind partially, largely, on the basis of life experience that is not too much on the nose. It's like having children, or life experience of his family and where they came from and how. And that ended up, there was an alchemy that affected his outlook on views that otherwise are views you could see in a classroom, arguing back and forth or among op-eds with propositional logic. And it seems like much, if not, but not all of your story was one of a view about a life experience, having a child, that at least your first instinct was to be extremely analytic about reading a book and talking to people and doing research to come up with the right approach. And it's just interesting to see the dynamic of life experience both informing something in a way that is not clear deductive logic and trying to use deductive logic to get to the bottom of the ineffable. I don't know if there's something there.
Well, I was reflecting on this question of why so often for me it starts with a book. And I think that some of it is, and it connects to what Professor Fried was sharing a little bit, and also to what you were sharing before, which is it can be destabilizing, like personally, but also to the people around you if you're shifting your views on things that are part of how they understand you to be. And so for me, I tend to be a maximizer. So like if I'm gonna buy, a toilet paper holder, I'm gonna read all the reviews, I'm gonna like research the options, I really wanna make sure I'm making a good choice.
Can't wait this to be sponsored advertising for Costco.
So I and so I want to be able to, I want to really be able to think it through on my own before I incur whatever the costs are of shifting, of having to explain, or like, I need to be able to like reconfigure my understanding of myself sometimes, or think through the pros and the cons before I kind of, you know, share it more broadly. And I think that some of it is being able to really reflect privately. Not all decisions are like that. I mean, a lot of shifts do happen for me in public, but I do think that that piece, and being able to ask myself the question, like, what if this were true? Like, what if this thing that I haven't previously contemplated, that is, I'm starting to understand, and it's almost always a million different interconnected issues that also shift. That, yeah, sometimes it's easier for me to change my mind if I'm not having to justify or explain or defend.
Which is interesting. It seems maybe for both of our accounts so far, they're both accounts for which the people behind them are willing to evolve or change their own identities, that it's not an identity, self-identity thing that's holding you back from changing your mind. It's, I think there's some Joan Didion quote about, I have a number of past selves, some of whom I'm not even in touch with anymore, that I think some of us may be more willing than others to contemplate that. Not that there's a right or wrong answer, but that it's harder to change your mind probably when doing so would say that you have become fundamentally different. Very interesting. And of course, I note that I think Naomi Wolf has significantly changed her mind on a number of topics since she wrote that book. Yeah. I Googled Naomi Wolf chemtrails, and you'll see what I mean. On that weird note, over to you, Professor Charles.
Thank you. So reflecting on this, I think I have to start with procedure and process. My civil procedure students in the room understand the importance. There's something about a state and a process and a being and an understanding in which one is always open to rethinking and reflecting and changing and adapting with a set of circumstances, right? And there are aspects of which in all of our daily lives it's relatively trivial. So unlike hardcore Minnesotans who will always wear shorts no matter what the temperature is, most of us adjust to facts, right? It's cold, we put on a coat. All right, we put on something long. I put on lots of things when it's cold. Warm, we do something else. Right? So there are aspects in our daily lives, trivial to sublime, in which we adopt a posture of openness and reflection and thinking through facts and factual circumstance and change circumstance. And of course, there are aspects of our daily lives in which our identity is tied up to whatever is the thing that we believe in the moment, or have believed for a very long time, is understood and viewed in a particular way. So in thinking about this, I was also thinking about process as well, about the importance of openness, right? And yet not being so open, right, as not to have identity and direction. And two particular things came to mind. One is semi-professional, semi-personal. The other is more professional. So the first of it is, many of you know my family history. My family is of Haitian descent. And most of my work is really around democracy and autonomy and agency and self-determination. And I have to imagine that it is autobiographical. I came to it not having consciously chosen it in that way, but more than likely subconsciously probably thinking about questions of democracy and identity. Post-earthquake in Haiti, I went back to Haiti. I hadn't been back in a very, very long time. So went back and experienced a set of circumstances that I really hadn't wrapped my mind around. That is a sense of lack of resources, lack of institutions, so little worked. And it confronted me with a professional position that I'd long held on the importance of agency and self-rule and democracy. And the question that confronted me with was, are there circumstances in which it is necessary to impose a rule from the outside and to rethink our understanding of what consent of the governed means as a first pass, right? Not as a final destination, but as a first pass, because it might simply be the case that given the suffering in which a broad range of people are experiencing, and the fact that they only have one life to live, and the fact that their institutions are not going to work, and that there's no way that they can provide a way out of the situation in which they find themselves, that isn't there a broader obligation to begin to think about a way of helping and supporting them that may not have anything to deal with their self-determination, that may not be respective of their self-determination and their agency. I found that thought very frightening because it put me in a situation that was inconsistent with everything that I had held dear. While at the same time, though, I found myself confronted with a set of circumstances in which I admitted to my family when I went back and to my spouse and felt in many ways guilty about it. That is, for every moment that I was there, I couldn't wait to get back on the plane and leave because of the sense of despair, right, that I experience in many ways as an outsider, right, because you're with the set of mindset and choices, notwithstanding the family history, you really are an outsider if you're not there, living there, and a part of it. So my core professional identity is about consent, self-determination. Yet I'm confronted with a set of circumstances for me, that didn't make a lot of sense. That it seemed that the best thing to do and to think about was how can you impose a solution, a framework, build institutions from externally until one can provide the internal capacity, and then people can take over, right? So for me, those thoughts were very frightening because the thing that I held dear, the ideas that I held dear intellectually, for me did not make sense in that circumstance. So one of the places in which, so why did I change my mind? That is, I changed my mind from someone who believed that the concept of self-determination trumped everything to someone who has to be open to the idea that there are certain sets of circumstances, certain levels of suffering, that one can't simply just look at in the face and then say to people, oh, you know what? If it's your suffering, and if you want to change, go right ahead. I'm going to get on that plane and get back to Miami as soon as possible. So I felt convicted that, that I couldn't hold both of those things, and to hold on to the idea of self-determination above all, I think would also be to condemning a bunch of people, so many of whom looked very much like me and weren't in for an accident of history, that I would be in the same set of circumstances in which they find themselves. So that's one. The other is much more professional, and deals with a set of cases. In 1993, the court decided cases in the racial gerrymandering context in which Justice O'Connor in particular held that racial gerrymandered districts were subject to, were justiciable. I first remember reading the way that she talked about those, and for a very long time, until a couple years ago, when she talked about how districts carved to reify a particular set of identities eventually clashed to sort of this broader conception of who we are as a polity. I've now come to appreciate more the fact that how we take for granted that we all get along, notwithstanding our distinctive identities, and that it's a precious commodity that has to be cherished and nourished. And part of it, I think, is related to process, right? Being open-minded, being willing to confront ugly facts on the ground, being willing to think differently in the face of human suffering, being willing to let go of intellectual positions when they don't make sense, and trying to think about how is it that we all get along in this particular polity. So on both of those sets of issues, I've become much less dogmatic than I was previously, and much more open to a set of alternatives than I would have thought of myself many, many years ago, and certainly prior to those experiences.
Thank you for sharing these stories. On the first one, the way you were able to tell it does seem like something that it's so great. You said it was semi-professional, semi-personal. It was a all professional view about self-determination, and that's one of your calling cards as a scholar. And it sounds like you ended up shifting your view on self-determination as an end versus as a means through the experience of the visit to Haiti. In a seminar you might teach here about self-determination, do you think it is effective or sufficient as an argument to simply to kind of be able to tell that story and then have people reconsider within your seminar that they might come in with views about self-determination is everything, and or whatever it is? Is that a form of persuasion, or is the only real way to get them around to your view is to take that trip or one like it?
It's a great question. So this semester I'm teaching a seminar on critical race theory, and part of the epistemic methodology of some critical race theorists is storytelling, right? The importance of sharing one's experiences, and to think about the relationship between that and legal argumentation. And part of the argument of some critical race theorists, not all, is that method of knowing is and ought to be relevant to how we think about legal persuasion and legal argumentation. So certainly in some contexts, and maybe even in many contexts, I think it is a relevant way. It shouldn't be the only thing. There are other ways of knowing, right? And part of what one thinks about are what happens when you exclude certain ways, what happens when you leave aside the data, what happens when you leave aside the personal experience, what happens when you leave aside the philosophy, right? So there are many ways of knowing, there are many ways of reasoning through, and so I think in a seminar under certain sets of circumstances, this way too has its role, maybe small, but it certainly has its role of helping people to see a different perspective, right? Doesn't suffice all by itself, but I think relevant.
That might be a question worth asking the whole panel, and there may be views within everybody gathered here, which I'm assuming many, if not most, are students, about the educational process and what we're supposed to be learning and changing our minds about in the process by which we do or don't do that. I think the reality, or maybe it's the caricature of, say, Harvard Business School, is that, you know, on any given Tuesday, every single class about reading a P&L is teaching exactly the same case in more or less the same way. Whereas at HLS, the experience you'd have in Professor Hansen's torts class may vary somewhat from what you would get in any other professor's torts class. And that's a strength of the school, which includes in methodology and level of invitation of personal storytelling. I know colleagues of ours who lay out, as part of their pedagogical methodology at the beginning of the class, no first-person stories. We're going to talk about the briefs. And I'm curious, everybody's thoughts, is that kind of ecumenicism a strength rather than having to decide up front? And that ecumenicism is not possible as much, perhaps, in the legal system itself. That when you take an appeal from a case, what are we mostly reading, at least in our doctrinal classes, but appellate opinions, which are completely denuded by design of all the facts and stories below. We're just reading one judge's account of all the facts and deferring to them below. But is that maybe then not a great process for justice? If that ecumenicism is good enough for our learning, why shouldn't it be present in our actual lawyering and deciding? So I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that cluster of questions.
Well, that's why appellate courts are either panels of 3 or 7 or 9 for just that reason.
Because they're bringing different life experiences to the table.
Yes.
But the process is making sure that the pipeline that they are supposed to decide upon, the facts about the case and everything, is hugely analytic, right? It's not first-person narratives told directly to the panel.
Depends. I mean, different appellate judges are more or less open about those things.
Got it. Professor Viscomi.
So I would say from a dispute systems design perspective.
Oh, is your mic off?
Goodness gracious.
There we go.
Sure is. All right. So what I would say is from a dispute systems design perspective, I think those questions are really important, right? So if you look at restorative justice processes, if you look at different ways that people can come together to think about what justice looks like or what makes sense to them, a lot of them really have storytelling front and center. And so we think a lot about, like, how do you enable people to think about what the process is, the phrase that was historically used from the Pound Conference, Frank Sanders' phrase was around fitting the forum to the fuss. So how do we...
Fitting form to the...
Fitting the forum to the fuss.
The forum to the fuss.
Yeah. So how do we think about where mediation might make sense, where restorative justice makes sense? But as I think about the stories that are the most powerful, there are ones in which the process by which we figure out how to move forward in the context of a dispute is one in which we allow the people not just to, and again, it depends on the context, right? There are plenty where having an appellate panel make a decision that is devoid of external context might be really important. And questions of standing really fall away when what you're saying is, how do we say to people who need to navigate a tough issue, who is it important for you to have in the room with you? What is important for people to understand about your experience of this particular challenge, right? And there are often ways in which the context that people are able to add and share about their life experience have a profound impact on what moves forward. So there just one really quick story that comes to mind on this is a story from an organization that we've done some work with in Baltimore. They do restorative justice work in neighborhoods in this case. And there was a student who had damaged the car of someone in the neighborhood. They were playing basketball. And and basically the guy was like, it was a new car, first new car I've ever had. I want to be paid back for the damage to my car. Like, this is pretty straightforward. They spent a long time preparing for a restorative justice process. The student asked for both his parents to be in the room, and his parents were divorced, had not been together in the same place for an extended period of time, but they both agreed to be there to support him. They were in the room, and he was able to share some of what his context was. By the end of the session, I'll speed it up because I really want to hear what your thoughts are on this. The person whose car had been damaged said, not only do I not want money for the car, what I would like is to find a way to support you as you're navigating some of the challenges, like the academic challenges that you're experiencing. And if I can help you and you can get into college, I want to pay for you to go to college, which he did, and he did. That does not happen, in my view, in a world that's devoid of first-person stories and experiences. It doesn't mean that doesn't make, I like the ecumenicism of the classroom. I like that different people, I think our brains work in different ways, the way we engage with the world works in different ways. But I think the notion of thinking about what process makes sense in what context is a really important one.
It's also a statement about the power of breaking out of the role that everybody expects of you. Again, harkens back to Professor Fried's point about not being the movement conservative all the time that he had been slotted into being, and how powerful that can be. And again, it comes back to our curriculum, how often in our first-year curriculum, I feel like it's, make the argument, play that role. That's part of what we're training you to do, which is a different angle on things. I realize, by the way, given the structure and process of our schedules, at 1:30, you all have to probably apparate somewhere else for class. So Professor Charles, you're going to get the last word, and I think we're going to have to adjourn.
I don't have much more to add. I mean, I think there is room for different ways of knowing. And I think part of what an institution like this does is to hopefully help surface those different ways. In some contexts, it predominates more than others. And I think that kind of helps us to bring the full perspective to the table as much as we can, as we try to be a group of people who are open to changing and thinking, rethinking, as well as reaffirming at times.
Well, thank you for participating in this forum. We hope it was somewhat fitting to whatever fuss you came in with. And we're just grateful for this moment to gather and reflect on it. It was all too short. And maybe we'll look for ways to continue it, either all together or in breakout groups of some kind at a future time.
And next Monday, if you want to talk about, go ahead, Emily, you take it away.
I was just going to say, we are doing a part 2 to this, which is an opportunity to work with Rachel and people in her clinic to have conversations about your own stories in a facilitated manner with lunch. And there was a registration link on the email about this, but we'll send it around again, and we hope some of you will be willing to try it out yourselves.
Thank
Sure.
you, Emily. Thank you for organizing HLS Beyond.